Mr. Harrington, please do not sign that. Grace Miller's quiet voice crossed the executive conference room just as Blake Harrington lowered his pen toward the most important contract of his career. Every conversation stopped. 30 floors above downtown Boston, beneath cold morning light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, attorneys, investors, and senior executives turned toward the young administrative assistant standing near the end of the walnut table. Grace wore a simple light blue blouse, an inexpensive navy skirt, and the same practical shoes she wore almost every day. Nothing about her suggested power. Nothing about her suggested that she belonged among people discussing a real estate development worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Blake slowly lifted his eyes from the contract. His tailored charcoal suit, silver watch, and controlled expression reflected a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Excuse me." Grace swallowed, but she did not look away. "You should not sign the agreement yet." Vanessa Cole, the vice president who had spent nearly a year negotiating the acquisition, immediately stiffened. "Grace, this meeting does not concern you." "It does now," Grace replied. A hush fell over the room. Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her as if trying to understand how an employee several levels below him had found the nerve to interrupt a closing that lawyers had spent months preparing. "Who gave you permission to interrupt this meeting?" he asked. Grace held a folder against her chest. Her fingers tightened slightly around its edges. She knew what was at stake. Her rent was due in 12 days. Her old sedan had needed repairs twice that winter. She had no powerful family waiting to rescue her if Harrington Development fired her before lunch. But inside that folder was something she could no longer pretend she had not seen. "No one gave me permission," she said. Vanessa rose from her chair. "Then leave the documents and return to your desk." Grace remained where she was. Blake's expression hardened. He had built Harrington Development into one of Boston's most respected real estate firms by making decisions quickly and expecting people around him to understand hierarchy. To him, Grace was the quiet assistant who scheduled meetings, organized files, and occasionally appeared with coffee or paperwork. He barely remembered when she had joined the company. Now she was standing between him and a deal that could define his legacy. "Grace," Blake said, deliberately emphasizing her name, "do you understand what delaying this closing could cost us?" "Yes, Mr. Harrington." "Then explain why you are still standing there." Grace crossed the room and placed the folder beside the contract. Vanessa's face changed the moment she recognized it. Grace noticed. So did Blake. "Read page 47, Grace said. Blake did not touch the folder. "What am I looking for?" "A signature that does not match the correspondence attached to the final agreement." Vanessa interrupted sharply. "She is misunderstanding routine revisions." Grace turned toward her. "Then the email from Martin Ellis should be easy to explain." Vanessa went silent. Blake's eyes moved from Vanessa to Grace, then finally to the folder. He set his expensive pen on the table. For the first time that morning, uncertainty entered his face. He believed a simple assistant might be about to cost him the biggest deal of his career. He had no idea she might be the only person in that room protecting him from it. 3 months earlier, Grace Miller had been almost invisible to Blake Harrington, which was exactly how people at Harrington Development had learned to treat employees without impressive titles. Grace arrived every morning before 8, parked her 10-year-old sedan several blocks from the office to avoid expensive downtown parking, and carried the same canvas lunch bag through the glass doors of the company's Boston headquarters. At 26, she had no designer wardrobe, no influential family name, and no interest in pretending otherwise. She wore simple blouses, practical skirts, and comfortable shoes, and she performed her work with a quiet precision that rarely attracted attention because mistakes were noticed more easily than competence. Grace scheduled meetings, organized contracts, corrected filing errors, and remembered details senior executives often forgot. She knew which clients required accessibility accommodations, which conference rooms had broken equipment, and which documents needed signatures before deadlines became emergencies. Blake knew almost none of that. To him, Grace was simply one of the administrative employees somewhere beyond the executive floor. One Tuesday morning, Daniel Brooks, the longtime chief financial officer, urgently needed a financial report delivered to a strategy meeting. Grace volunteered to take it upstairs. When the elevator opened on the 32nd floor, she stepped into a world of dark walnut, polished glass, and framed photographs of multi-million-dollar developments. Inside the conference room, Blake stood at the head of the table discussing expansion plans with senior executives. Grace entered quietly and placed the report beside Daniel. "Thank you, Grace," Daniel said. Blake looked up. His eyes moved briefly over her modest light blue blouse and inexpensive shoes. "Next time," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "send someone who looks like they belong in the room." A few executives gave uncomfortable smiles. Vanessa Cole laughed softly. Grace felt warmth rise into her face, but she did not defend herself. "The report was marked urgent, Mr. Harrington," she said calmly. "So I brought it immediately." Blake had already turned back toward the presentation. "That will be all." Grace walked out without changing her pace. Inside the elevator, she stared at the descending numbers and allowed herself one slow breath. She had learned years earlier that embarrassment became heavier when you carried someone else's opinion home with you. By noon, she was back at her desk correcting a vendor invoice that would have cost the company several $1,000s if processed incorrectly. No one applauded. Grace did not expect them to. At lunch, Vanessa passed the break room and noticed Grace opening a container of homemade pasta. "Still bringing lunch from home?" she asked with an amused smile. "It saves money," Grace replied. "You work for a luxury development company, Grace. You should at least try to look successful." Grace closed the container gently. "I thought working well was supposed to count." Vanessa smiled as though Grace had said something naive. "At this company, perception counts first." Then she walked away. Grace looked through the break room window at Boston traffic moving below. She did not know that Blake was upstairs preparing the largest acquisition Harrington Development had ever attempted. She did not know Vanessa would soon place hundreds of pages from that deal on her desk. And neither Blake nor Vanessa understood that the quiet employee they considered too ordinary for the executive room was exactly the kind of person who would notice what everyone important had overlooked. 2 weeks after Blake Harrington dismissed Grace from the executive room with a single humiliating remark, Harrington Development announced the project that would dominate the company for the rest of the year. Blake gathered senior staff beneath the bright lights of the 32nd floor conference room and revealed plans for Harbor Point Square, a major mixed-use development on several acres of commercial property outside downtown Boston. The acquisition alone involved tens of millions of dollars, while the completed project was expected to be worth several $100 million. To Blake, it was more than another development. It was the deal that would place Harrington Development among the most influential private real estate firms in New England. Vanessa Cole stood beside the presentation screen with unmistakable confidence. As vice president overseeing acquisitions, she had spent months assembling agreements with property owners, reviewing purchase terms, and pushing negotiations toward a closing date Blake considered non-negotiable. "If we stay on schedule," Vanessa said, "we close before the end of the quarter." Blake nodded. "Then we stay on schedule." That sentence quietly became the rule governing everything that followed. Departments worked late. Attorneys revised contracts. Financial analysts updated projections. Administrative staff processed mountains of documents moving between offices, consultants, lenders, and property owners. Grace received her share without ceremony. One Thursday afternoon, Vanessa dropped several thick folders onto Grace's desk. "These need to be organized for legal review by Monday morning." Grace looked at the stack. "All of them." "That is what I said." Vanessa started walking away, then turned back. "And Grace, do not overcomplicate this. Sort them, confirm the required pages are present, and flag anything missing." Grace worked through Friday evening and returned early Saturday morning to finish. The office was nearly silent, with only the hum of ventilation and distant traffic below. She checked dates, signatures, attachments, and correspondence against the closing checklist. Shortly after 10, she reached the file belonging to Martin Ellis, owner of Ellis Office Supply, a small business occupying one of the properties included in the acquisition. The final agreement stated that Martin had accepted the revised purchase terms and agreed to vacate the property within 60 days. Grace compared the signature page with earlier correspondence. Something felt wrong. The dates did not follow the sequence she expected. She opened another folder. An email printed 3 weeks earlier contained a message from Martin stating clearly that he could not accept the revised relocation deadline because moving so quickly would threaten his business. Grace read the final agreement again. It treated that objection as resolved. Yet she could find no later message showing that Martin had changed his position. She checked every attachment twice. Then a third time. Monday morning, Grace carried the file to Vanessa's office. I think there is a problem with the Ellis agreement. Vanessa continued typing. What kind of problem? The final document says he accepted the revised terms, but his last correspondence says he did not. Vanessa stopped typing. For 1 second, her expression changed. Then the polished confidence returned. There were additional conversations. Are they documented somewhere else? Not everything happens through email, Grace. Grace placed the papers on the desk. His signature page is dated before one of the revisions. Vanessa looked down at the documents, then slowly back at Grace. Your job is to organize the file, not interpret the transaction. I understand, but legal should probably review this. Vanessa's voice became colder. Legal has reviewed what legal needs to review. Grace remained still. Vanessa pushed the folder back toward her. Just file it. Grace picked it up, but as she walked away, one thought followed her through the quiet hallway. If the paperwork was truly harmless, why had Vanessa looked frightened before she looked annoyed? Grace returned to her desk with the Ellis folder pressed against her chest, but Vanessa's words followed her more closely than the paperwork did. Just file it. For the rest of Monday morning, Grace tried to convince herself that there might be an explanation she had not seen. Perhaps Martin Ellis had approved the final terms during a phone call. Perhaps another attorney had documented the change somewhere outside the file. Perhaps Vanessa was right and Grace was reaching beyond the limits of her job. But every possibility led back to the same problem. The closing package contained no clear record showing that Martin had accepted the revised terms. Shortly after lunch, Grace opened the electronic document archive and carefully reviewed the correspondence she was authorized to access. She found an earlier draft giving Martin 120 days to relocate Ellis office supply. The final agreement reduced that period to 60 days. Another email showed Martin explaining that his company had operated from the property for nearly 20 years and that moving inventory, equipment, and employees within 2 months would create serious financial hardship. Grace read the message twice. His final sentence was unmistakable. I cannot agree to the revised relocation terms as written. Yet the closing package treated the matter as settled. Grace printed the email and returned to Vanessa's office. This time, Vanessa closed the door behind her. I told you to file it. I found this in the project archive. Vanessa barely glanced at the page. There were later discussions. Then there should be something confirming his approval. Vanessa's expression tightened. You are an administrative assistant, Grace. You are not acquisition counsel. I know. Then stop acting like you are. Grace remained quiet. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. People at your level survive in companies like this by knowing when not to ask questions. The sentence landed harder than Blake's remark in the conference room because Vanessa was no longer mocking her appearance. She was telling Grace that honesty itself had a rank. Are you asking me to include the agreement without flagging the discrepancy? Grace asked. Vanessa stared at her. I am asking you to do the job you are paid to do. That is not the same answer. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa stood and opened the door. The closing is Friday. I do not want to hear about this again. Grace walked back to her desk carrying the email. She thought about her checking account, her rent, the repair estimate waiting in the glove compartment of her sedan. Losing her job would not be dramatic. It would be practical and immediate. Bills would still arrive. Groceries would still cost money. No wealthy relative would appear to solve the problem. That evening, most of the office emptied by 6:30, but Grace stayed beneath the fluorescent lights with the Ellis file open beside her keyboard. She could remain silent, collect her paycheck, and tell herself that senior people had made the decision. It would be easy. That was what frightened her. Before leaving, she placed a copy of Martin's email inside the closing review folder and added a formal discrepancy note requesting legal verification. The next morning, the note was back on her desk. Across the top, in Vanessa's handwriting, were 4 words: "Remove this before closing." Grace stared at the message for a long moment. Then she opened her calendar and saw the final closing meeting scheduled for Friday at 9 in the morning. Blake Harrington would be signing the agreement himself. Grace folded Vanessa's note, placed it beside Martin's email, and understood that the question was no longer whether someone had made a mistake. The question was how much she was willing to risk to keep that mistake from becoming permanent. By Thursday afternoon, the closing package had become the center of Harrington developments. Attention. Attorneys moved between conference rooms, executives checked numbers against final projections, and Vanessa spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the difficult part was already over. Grace sat at her desk with Martin Ellis's email open on her screen and Vanessa's handwritten instruction hidden inside her notebook. She had barely slept the night before. Every practical argument told her to stay quiet. She was 26 years old, earning an ordinary salary in one of the most expensive cities in the country, with rent, insurance, groceries, and a repair bill waiting for her at home. Blake Harrington could replace an administrative assistant before the end of the week. Martin Ellis would probably never know she had seen his email. That thought was exactly why Grace could not ignore it. Shortly before 5, Daniel Brooks stopped beside her desk. "You are still here? I need to finish something." Daniel noticed the Ellis file. "Harbor Point." Grace hesitated. Daniel was senior enough to help, but Vanessa had made the chain of command painfully clear. "Mr. Brooks, if someone finds a discrepancy in a closing document, what is the proper procedure?" Daniel's expression became serious. "You flag it for legal review. Even if a senior executive says it has already been handled? Especially then." Grace looked down at the folder. Daniel studied her for a moment. "Is there something I should know?" Before Grace could answer, Vanessa appeared at the end of the hallway. "Daniel, Blake is looking for you upstairs." Daniel glanced between the 2 women, then left. Vanessa waited until he disappeared into the elevator. "What were you discussing?" "Procedure." Vanessa stepped closer. "I thought we settled this." "No. You told me to remove a discrepancy notice." Vanessa lowered her voice. "Do you have any idea how many people have worked on this acquisition? Lawyers, analysts, consultants, lenders. And you think you found something all of them missed?" "Maybe I did." Vanessa gave a short laugh. "This is exactly why Blake does not want people wandering into rooms where they do not belong." Grace felt the insult, but this time it did not embarrass her. It clarified everything. If the agreement is correct, legal review will confirm it. And if your little objection delays tomorrow's closing, you will have made yourself very memorable. "I understand." "Do you?" Vanessa asked. "Because administrative positions disappear quietly, Grace." The threat was wrapped in professional language, but its meaning was unmistakable. Grace looked at the woman in front of her and realized Vanessa expected fear to finish the conversation. Instead, Grace asked, "Did Martin Ellis agree to the 60-day relocation deadline?" Vanessa's expression hardened. "Go home." That evening, Grace drove her old sedan through Boston traffic with the radio turned off. At a red light, she looked at the repair estimate lying on the passenger seat and almost laughed at the timing. Doing the right thing sounded noble until it came with an invoice. By 8 the next morning, Grace was back at Harrington Development. She printed Martin's email, the conflicting signature page, the revision history, and Vanessa's handwritten instruction. She placed everything inside one folder. At 8:55, senior executives entered the closing room upstairs. At 9:12, Grace received a message requesting the final administrative package. She carried it to the 32nd floor. Through the glass wall, she saw Blake Harrington seated at the head of the table, expensive pen in hand. Vanessa stood near him, smiling. Grace entered quietly and placed the closing package on the table. Blake opened the agreement and turned toward the signature page. Vanessa looked directly at Grace, warning her without speaking. Grace could still walk away. Then Blake lowered his pen. "Mr. Harrington," Grace said, her voice quiet but clear, "please do not sign that." Blake Harrington did not sign. His pen stopped less than an inch above the signature line as every person in the conference room turned toward Grace. For several seconds, the only sound was the low hum of the building ventilation. Vanessa recovered first. "Grace has misunderstood an administrative issue," she said. "There is no reason to delay closing." Blake looked at Grace. "You have 30 seconds. Explain." Grace opened the folder she had carried upstairs and placed Martin Ellis's email beside the final agreement. "The closing package says Mr. Ellis accepted the 60-day relocation requirement. His last documented response says he rejected it." Blake glanced at the page. "That could have been resolved later." "I thought so too. I searched the authorized project archive and could not find confirmation." Vanessa stepped forward. "Because the matter was handled outside the email chain." Grace placed another page on the table. "Then this signature date still needs to be explained. The signature appears before the final revision it supposedly approves." Daniel Brooks leaned forward immediately. One of the attorneys reached for the documents. Vanessa's confident expression tightened. "This is ridiculous. We have spent months preparing this transaction." Grace reached into the folder one final time and placed Vanessa's handwritten instruction beside the email. "Yesterday, I submitted a discrepancy notice requesting legal verification. I was told to remove it before closing." Blake read the 4 handwritten words. "Remove this before closing." His eyes lifted slowly toward Vanessa. "Did you write this?" Vanessa hesitated. "I was preventing an inexperienced employee from creating unnecessary confusion." "That was not my question." The room went silent. "Yes," Vanessa said. Blake leaned back, his jaw tense. "Daniel?" Daniel was already reviewing the agreement with corporate counsel. "We stopped the closing until this is verified." An outside attorney nodded. "I agree. We need direct confirmation from Mr. Ellis before anyone signs." Vanessa stared at them. "Do you understand what a delay could do to financing?" Blake closed the contract. "I understand what signing an agreement we cannot verify could do." Grace felt the tension leave her shoulders, but relief lasted only a moment. Blake turned toward her. "You should have brought this directly to legal instead of interrupting a closing. I tried to flag it through the review process." "And when that failed?" Grace looked toward Vanessa, then back at him. "I came here." Blake did not thank her. Instead, he instructed Daniel to begin an immediate review and told everyone else the closing was postponed. By 10:30, rumors had traveled through 3 floors of the company. Some employees said Grace had saved the deal. Others said she had embarrassed a vice president over paperwork she did not understand. Vanessa made certain the second version spread faster. That afternoon, Grace was temporarily removed from Harbor Point work while the legal department reviewed the document trail. She returned to her desk under the quiet attention of coworkers who suddenly found reasons not to meet her eyes. Her computer access remained active, but the project folders disappeared from her permissions. Grace understood what that meant. She had told the truth, and she still might lose her job for the way she had told it. Near 5, she began organizing her personal desk drawer, not because anyone had fired her, but because she wanted to be prepared. Upstairs, Daniel Brooks was on a conference call with Martin Ellis. Blake stood beside the window listening. "Mr. Harrington," Martin said through the speaker, "I never accepted 60 days. I told your people that repeatedly." Blake turned from the Boston skyline. Across the table, Vanessa's empty chair suddenly seemed much louder than anything anyone could have said. Martin Ellis's statement changed the investigation from an administrative disagreement into something Blake Harrington could no longer dismiss. By Friday evening, corporate counsel had compared the electronic revision history, email archive, signature records, and internal approval notes. The pattern was uncomfortable. Martin had agreed to sell his property under an earlier version of the deal, but he had never approved the shortened relocation period added during later negotiations. Somewhere between those versions, the closing package had begun presenting his original signature as if it confirmed terms that came afterward. Vanessa insisted it was a documentation failure rather than deliberate misconduct, but the legal team was no longer interested in explanations without evidence. On Monday morning, Daniel entered Blake's office carrying a preliminary review. "You need to read this." Blake took the report. "How bad?" Daniel remained standing. "If you had signed Friday, we would have closed using terms the property owner disputes and our records do not clearly support." Blake looked toward the harbor beyond the windows. "Could we have corrected it afterward?" "Maybe. After legal claims, financing complications, and questions from every investor involved." Daniel paused. "There is more." The review showed that Martin's disagreement had appeared in the project archive weeks earlier. Several people had handled pieces of the transaction, but Grace was the first person who had connected the revised deadline, the signature date, and the unanswered email. Blake closed the report slowly. "An administrative assistant caught this?" Daniel's expression hardened. Grace caught it because she read what was in front of her instead of assuming someone more important had already done it. Blake heard the rebuke. He also deserved it. He remembered Grace entering the executive conference room months earlier with an urgent report. He remembered looking at her inexpensive clothes and telling her to send someone who looked like they belonged there. At the time, the remark had seemed forgettable. Now it returned with uncomfortable precision. "Where is she?" Blake asked. "At her desk." Downstairs, Grace was placing a framed photograph of her parents into a small cardboard box. No one had told her to leave, but Vanessa had been placed on administrative leave that morning, and Grace assumed the company would eventually decide that an assistant who disrupted a major closing was inconvenient enough to remove as well. She was wrapping the frame in tissue paper when Daniel approached. "Why are you packing?" "Preparing." "For what?" Grace gave a small smile. "Whatever happens next." Daniel looked at the box. "Do not finish yet." 20 minutes later, Blake stood outside the administrative department. It was a floor he rarely visited. Employees straightened when they noticed him. Grace looked up from her desk. Blake saw the cardboard box, then the woman beside it in a simple light blue blouse. For once, he noticed details he had previously considered. Beneath his attention. "Grace, may I speak with you?" She followed him into a small conference room. Blake closed the door. Legal confirmed Martin Ellis never approved the final relocation terms. Grace said nothing. "If you had stayed quiet for another 10 minutes Friday, my signature would have been on that agreement. That is why I spoke." Blake studied her. "You knew you could lose your job." "Yes." "Then why risk it for a man you had never met?" Grace's eyes remained steady. "Because whether I knew him was never the question." Blake had negotiated with billionaires, politicians, lenders, and attorneys without struggling for words. But in that small conference room, facing an employee he once believed did not belong upstairs, he found himself with nothing intelligent to say. Grace had protected a stranger because she believed the truth mattered even when telling it offered her nothing. And Blake finally understood that the person with the lowest title in the room had shown the highest standard of leadership. Blake remained silent long enough for Grace to wonder whether her answer had offended him. Instead, he looked through the glass wall toward rows of employees working beneath fluorescent lights and realized how rarely he had considered what courage looked like without authority behind it. "I owe you an apology," he said. Grace had expected questions about the documents, perhaps even a warning about procedure. She had not expected that. Blake continued. "What I said to you in the executive conference room months ago was disrespectful. I judged whether you belonged there by how you looked and what position you held." Grace watched him carefully. "Yes, you did." The simplicity of her answer made him uncomfortable because she did not rush to excuse him. "I was wrong," Blake said. "And you were right about Ellis." Grace nodded. "Thank you for saying that." Blake placed a folder on the table. "The company is offering you a substantial performance bonus. I also want to discuss moving you into a higher position." Grace looked at the folder but did not open it. "What happens to Mr. Ellis?" Blake paused. "Legal is renegotiating the relocation terms." "Does he get a fair amount of time to move his business?" "That is what we are working toward." "And the acquisition process?" "We are reviewing it." Grace's eyes remained steady. Then I would rather discuss the bonus after those things are resolved. Blake frowned slightly. Grace, this is not payment for silence. I know. But I did not tell the truth because I thought it would pay better. The room went quiet. Blake slowly sat back. There it was again, the difference between them. He had spent much of his career measuring decisions in dollars, leverage, deadlines, and advantage. Grace kept returning to a simpler question. Was the decision right? What do you want? He asked. A process where someone at my level can flag a serious concern without being told their job might disappear. Blake lowered his eyes. Vanessa said that to you? Grace did not answer immediately. She did not need to. By Wednesday, the internal review had expanded beyond the Ellis agreement. Investigators found that Vanessa had repeatedly pressured staff to resolve documentation problems informally when delays threatened acquisition targets. The company placed her on extended administrative leave while outside counsel completed its investigation. Blake did not announce conclusions before the review was finished, but he removed her authority over Harbor Point immediately. More importantly, he called Martin Ellis himself. Mr. Ellis, this is Blake Harrington. Martin's voice was guarded. I know who you are. Then you probably know why I am calling. Blake acknowledged that the closing documents had not reflected Martin's final position and told him no transaction would proceed until new terms were negotiated directly and reviewed independently. Martin was quiet before saying, Your assistant was the first person over there who seemed interested in what I actually said. Blake looked across his office toward the city. She is not my assistant, he replied slowly. And I should have understood sooner that her title was never the important part. 2 weeks later, Harrington Development adopted a formal ethics escalation procedure, allowing employees at every level to raise documented concerns directly with legal and compliance without approval from their immediate supervisors. Grace accepted a new role helping design that process, but only after Martin received a revised agreement giving his company sufficient time and financial support to relocate without threatening its survival. On Grace's first morning in the new position, Blake passed her desk and stopped. Months earlier, he would have walked by without knowing her name. Good morning, Grace. She looked up. Good morning, Mr. Harrington. He almost continued walking, then turned back. For what it is worth, you belonged in that room before any of us realized why. Grace gave him a small, thoughtful smile. I belonged there because I had something important to say. Blake nodded. Exactly. And for once, he listened to the difference. 6 months later, Harbor Point Square was moving forward under an agreement that looked very different from the one Blake Harrington had nearly signed. Martin Ellis received enough time and financial support to relocate Ellis Office Supply without closing the business he had spent nearly 20 years building. Harrington Development also completed its outside review, and Vanessa Cole left the company after investigators concluded that her handling of acquisition documents had violated internal standards. Blake did not celebrate her departure. By then, he understood that the deeper failure had belonged to a culture he had helped create, one where deadlines were praised more loudly than questions and employees learned that challenging authority could cost them their careers. Grace Miller had become an ethics and compliance coordinator, a position that fit her experience without pretending one courageous decision had magically turned her into an executive. She still drove the same old sedan. She still brought lunch from home most days. Her wardrobe remained simple, and her light blue blouses became familiar around the office. What changed was the way people responded when she entered a room. They no longer looked past her. More importantly, Grace had not changed the way she treated them. On a clear October morning, she joined Blake, Daniel, several attorneys, and department leaders for a quarterly compliance meeting on the 32nd floor. It was the same conference room where Blake had once told her that someone else should deliver a report because she did not look like she belonged there. Grace noticed the same walnut table, the same Boston skyline, and even the same chair near the door. She took her seat without hesitation. Halfway through the meeting, a young junior analyst named Rachel Foster appeared at the doorway carrying a folder. Mr. Harrington, I am sorry to interrupt. One executive glanced toward the clock. Can this wait? Rachel froze. Grace recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone deciding whether speaking was worth the embarrassment that might follow. Blake recognized it too. He closed the report in front of him. "No," he said. The executive beside him looked surprised. Blake gestured toward an empty chair. "If she came upstairs because she found something important, we should hear it." Rachel stepped inside cautiously. "I noticed a reporting discrepancy in one of the contractor disclosures." "It might be nothing." "Then we will find out," Blake said. "Come in." "What did you find?" Rachel sat down and opened the folder. No one laughed. No one asked whether she belonged there. Grace watched Blake listen as the analyst explained the numbers. The discrepancy turned out to be minor, easily corrected before it caused any problem, but Blake thanked Rachel in front of the room for raising it early. When the meeting ended, Grace gathered her notes. Blake remained beside the window until the others left. "You noticed, did you not?" he asked. Grace smiled. "You listened." Blake nodded. "I am trying. That matters." He looked around the conference room. "I used to think leadership meant being the person with the answers." Grace placed her folder under her arm. "Sometimes it means making sure people are not afraid to bring you the questions." Blake smiled faintly. "I learned that from someone who supposedly did not belong in this room." Grace met his eyes. "You learned it because you decided to change." Then she walked toward the door. Blake did not need applause, and Grace did not need revenge. Months earlier, she had risked an ordinary job because staying silent would have been easier and wrong. Her decision protected a stranger, saved her company from a damaging mistake, and forced a powerful man to examine the kind of leader he had become. Grace had never needed wealth, status, or an impressive title to prove her worth. She had only needed the courage to remain honest when dishonesty would have been more convenient. And on that quiet October morning, the room finally reflected what she had understood all along. Dignity does not depend on where someone sits at the table, but on whether we are willing to listen when they speak.